Don't let the maid raise her eyes. The command echoed across the grand ballroom just as Evelyn Hart balanced a silver tray against her trembling hands. Laughter drifted beneath crystal chandeliers. Music flowed from a string quartet positioned near the marble staircase. Beyond the towering windows, the full moon hung above Blackwood Palace like a silent witness. Evelyn lowered her gaze immediately. She had learned that lesson years ago. In a palace filled with nobles, warriors, and powerful wolves, a servant survived by remaining unseen. The polished marble floor reflected the glow of hundreds of candles as guests dressed in silk and velvet moved through the hall. Their jewels sparkled brighter than anything Evelyn had ever owned. She quietly stepped between them, refilling glasses, collecting empty plates, and making herself as small as possible. "Careful, maid." A sharp voice stopped her. Lady Victoria Ashcroft stood near the center of the room, surrounded by admirers. Her golden gown shimmered beneath the candlelight. A cruel smile touched her lips as she looked Evelyn up and down. "Try not to embarrass the palace tonight." A few nearby nobles chuckled. Evelyn offered a polite nod. "Yes, my lady." The answer only seemed to amuse them more. She turned away before anyone could see the heat rising in her cheeks. Her fingers tightened around the tray until her knuckles turned pale. She reminded herself to breathe. One breath in, one breath out. Tonight was important. The Moon Ascension Ball happened only once every decade. Every influential family in the Northern Realm had gathered under one roof. Most importantly, Alpha King Damon Blackwood himself would appear before midnight. The thought alone sent a ripple of nervous energy through the room. Even the proudest nobles straightened whenever his name was mentioned. Evelyn moved toward a refreshment table when a sudden bump from behind sent the tray tilting sideways. Several glasses rattled. One tipped over completely. Red juice splashed across the front of her simple gray uniform. Silence briefly settled around her. Then came the laughter. "Look at her. She ruins everything." "Just a maid." Evelyn froze. The cool liquid soaked through the fabric. She stared at the stains spreading across her dress and wished the floor would open beneath her feet. Lady Victoria covered her mouth with fake sympathy. "How unfortunate." More laughter followed. Evelyn swallowed hard and lowered her eyes. Then something unexpected happened. As she reached for a cloth hidden in her apron, the sleeve of her uniform slipped back. A silver symbol appeared for only a second against her pale skin. It looked almost like moonlight pressed into flesh. Small, delicate, ancient. Most people never noticed it. But someone did. At the far end of the ballroom, the massive doors opened. Every conversation stopped. Every noble turned. Alpha King Damon Blackwood had arrived. Tall and commanding, dressed in black formal attire, he entered with effortless authority. The room seemed to hold its breath. Yet while everyone watched the king, Damon's silver eyes were fixed on something else entirely. Not the nobles. Not the musicians. Not the grand staircase. His gaze locked onto the young maid standing alone beside the refreshment table. More precisely, onto the strange silver mark disappearing beneath her sleeve. For the first time in years, the Alpha King looked genuinely shaken, and Evelyn Hart had no idea why. The moment passed so quickly that Evelyn convinced herself she had imagined it. By the time she pulled her sleeve back into place, the Alpha King was already surrounded by nobles eager for his attention. Music resumed. Conversations returned. The grand ballroom breathed again. Yet an uneasy feeling lingered in her chest. She could not explain why. The silver mark on her arm had always been there. As long as she could remember, it had rested just below her elbow like a faint moonlit pattern beneath her skin. The older servants used to whisper about it when she was a child. Some called it unusual. Others called it unlucky. Eventually, everyone stopped talking about it. Everyone except Mrs. Whitmore, the elderly housekeeper who had raised Evelyn inside the palace walls. Later that evening, Evelyn slipped through a quiet service corridor carrying a basket of folded linens. The sounds of the celebration faded behind thick stone walls. The palace felt different here. Older, colder, filled with secrets hidden beneath centuries of history. She rounded a corner and nearly collided with Mrs. Whitmore. The elderly woman steadied herself against the wall. "Slow down, child," she said with a tired smile. "You look as though you have seen a ghost." Evelyn hesitated. "Mrs. Whitmore, may I ask you something?" The older woman studied her face carefully. "Of course." Evelyn glanced around to make sure no one was listening. Do you know where I came from? The question seemed to freeze the air between them. Mrs. Whitmore's smile faded almost immediately. Why would you ask that? Because everyone else seems to know who they belong to. Evelyn lowered her eyes. Families. Names. Histories. I have nothing. For a long moment, Mrs. Whitmore said nothing at all. Then she gently touched Evelyn's shoulder. You were found at the palace gates 22 years ago. Evelyn nodded. She had heard that story many times. But who left me there? The older woman looked away. No one knows. Something in her voice sounded uncertain. Evelyn noticed it immediately. You do know something. Mrs. Whitmore sighed softly. There are truths that can bring more trouble than comfort. Please. The old woman closed her eyes briefly. When you were found, you were wrapped in a blanket unlike anything I had ever seen. White silk embroidered with silver thread. Evelyn's heartbeat quickened. What happened to it? It disappeared. Disappeared? The next morning it was gone. Mrs. Whitmore's expression darkened, along with several records from that year. Evelyn stared at her. Records? Before the conversation could continue, hurried footsteps echoed down the corridor. A young palace servant appeared around the corner. There you are, he said breathlessly. The steward is looking everywhere for you. Evelyn immediately straightened. Why? The Alpha King requested additional attendance for the royal wing. The basket nearly slipped from her hands. The royal wing? Immediately, the servant hurried away before she could ask another question. Mrs. Whitmore looked troubled now, more troubled than Evelyn had ever seen her. Be careful tonight, she whispered. Why? The older woman hesitated. Because sometimes the past has a way of finding people when they least expect it. Evelyn felt a chill run through her. Minutes later, she found herself walking toward the royal wing, carrying fresh linens through hallways lined with portraits of kings and queens long gone. Moonlight spilled through tall windows, casting silver patterns across the floor. As she passed one of the oldest paintings, something caught her attention. She slowed. Her breath stopped. The portrait showed a royal family from generations ago. At the center stood an elegant young woman wearing a silver crest shaped like a crescent moon. Evelyn stared at the symbol. It was identical to the mark hidden beneath her sleeve. The symbol stared back at Evelyn from across the decades. She stood motionless in the moonlit hallway, her basket forgotten in her hands as her eyes moved between the painted crest and the sleeve covering her arm. Her pulse thudded loudly in her ears. The crescent shape, the delicate silver lines. Every detail matched. A strange warmth spread through her chest, followed immediately by uncertainty. It could not mean anything. It had to be a coincidence. Royal families used countless symbols throughout history. Yet she could not pull her gaze away. Footsteps echoed somewhere behind her. Startled, Evelyn quickly lowered her eyes and continued down the corridor. The royal wing was quieter than the rest of the palace. Thick carpets softened every step. Tall windows overlooked the moonlit gardens below. The scent of cedarwood and polished stone lingered in the air. It felt like a different world from the servant quarters where she had spent most of her life. When she arrived, several attendants were already preparing guest chambers. Fresh flowers were being arranged. Candles were being replaced. Silver trays lined long tables beneath portraits of former rulers. Evelyn focused on her work. It was easier than thinking about mysterious symbols and forgotten records. Yet no matter how hard she tried, questions kept returning. Who had left her at the palace gates? Why had records disappeared? Why had Mrs. Whitmore looked so frightened? And why had the Alpha King seemed unsettled when he saw the mark on her arm? A voice suddenly interrupted her thoughts. Leave those here. Evelyn turned and immediately froze. Alpha King Damon Blackwood stood only a few feet away. The room seemed smaller somehow, the air heavier. His silver eyes rested on her with an intensity that made her heartbeat stumble. She quickly lowered her gaze. Yes, Your Majesty. She carefully placed the folded linens onto a nearby table. Normally, kings never noticed servants. They certainly did not speak to them directly. Yet Damon remained where he was. Silence stretched between them. Evelyn became painfully aware of every breath she took. Finally, he spoke again. How long have you worked in this palace? The question caught her off guard. Since I was a child, Your Majesty. You were raised here? Yes. Damon studied her carefully. Do you remember your parents? A strange ache touched her chest. No, Your Majesty. For a moment, something softened in his expression. Not pity. Something deeper. More complicated. Then the door opened. An older man entered carrying several leather-bound books beneath one arm. His gray hair framed a serious face marked by age and wisdom. The moment he saw Evelyn standing beside the king, surprise flashed across his features. "Your Majesty," he said with a respectful bow. Damon did not look away from Evelyn. "Professor Hawthorne." The scholar's gaze drifted briefly toward Evelyn's sleeve. His expression changed instantly. The color seemed to drain from his face. It happened so quickly that Evelyn almost thought she imagined it. "You asked for the historical archives," the professor said carefully. "I brought everything that survived from 22 years ago." 22 years ago. The exact number struck Evelyn like a bell. She was 22. Damon nodded once. "Good." Hawthorne lowered his voice. "Including the sealed records regarding the disappearance." Evelyn felt every muscle in her body tense. "Disappearance?" Damon glanced toward her, and the conversation ended immediately. "That will be all for now," he said. The dismissal was gentle but unmistakable. Evelyn bowed and stepped backward. Yet as she left the room, she could feel both men watching her. Once outside the chamber, she pressed a hand against her racing heart. She had come to the royal wing expecting another ordinary night of service. Instead, she had discovered a symbol hidden in a portrait, records connected to her birth year, and a conversation that seemed tied to a disappearance no one wanted to discuss. Somewhere deep inside, a feeling she had never known before began to grow. For the first time in her life, Evelyn suspected that the story she had always been told about herself was not the truth. Long after the celebration ended, sleep refused to come. Evelyn lay awake in her small room beneath the servant quarters, staring at the ceiling while moonlight spilled through the narrow window above her bed. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the silver crest in the portrait. She heard Professor Hawthorne mention a disappearance. She remembered the strange look that had crossed the Alpha King's face. Questions circled endlessly through her mind. Before dawn, she finally rose and dressed for work. The palace was unusually quiet in the early morning hours. Most guests still slept behind carved wooden doors while servants moved silently through the halls preparing breakfast trays and fresh tea. Evelyn welcomed the routine. Work usually helped clear her thoughts, yet today felt different. As she crossed the eastern corridor carrying a basket of linens, she became aware of something she had never noticed before. People were watching her. Not openly, not enough to seem suspicious. But whenever she glanced up, someone quickly looked away. A guard near the staircase, a maid arranging flowers, even one of the palace clerks sorting documents outside the records chamber. The feeling settled heavily in her stomach. By mid-morning, she found herself assigned to a section of the palace she rarely visited. The older library wing stood near the northern tower, far from the bustling servant passages. Dusty sunlight filtered through tall windows. Shelves stretched toward the ceiling, filled with centuries of history. Evelyn quietly placed returned books onto a cart and began sorting them. The silence should have been comforting. Instead, it felt expectant, as though the building itself was holding its breath. A faint sound drew her attention. Voices. She looked toward a partially open doorway at the far end of the library. Normally, she would have walked away immediately. Servants were not supposed to listen to private conversations. But one familiar name stopped her. Evelyn Hart. Her heart skipped. She froze beside a bookshelf. Professor Hawthorne stood inside the chamber speaking with Alpha King Damon. Ancient books and scrolls covered a large oak table between them. "The dates match," Hawthorne said quietly. "The timing is too precise to ignore." Damon remained silent for a moment. "And the crest?" "Identical." Hawthorne lowered his voice further. "There has not been another documented case in over 2 decades. Evelyn's pulse quickened. She knew they were talking about her. She should leave. She knew that. Yet her feet refused to move. Damon rested one hand against an open document. "What about the blanket?" Hawthorne hesitated. "The description matches the ceremonial cloth carried only by members of the Omega royal line." Silence followed. Heavy silence. Then came the words that made Evelyn's breath catch completely. "If our suspicion is correct," Hawthorne said carefully, "someone spent 22 years making certain she would never discover who she really is." Evelyn stepped backward instinctively. The movement caused a nearby book to slip from the cart. It struck the floor with a sharp sound. The conversation inside stopped instantly. Fear flashed through her chest. She turned and hurried away before anyone could open the door. Her heart pounded as she moved through the corridors. She did not stop until she reached the palace gardens. Cool autumn air filled her lungs. She pressed a hand against her chest and stared at the fountains glittering beneath the morning sun. Someone had hidden the truth. Someone had erased records. Someone had made sure she grew up believing she was nobody. And for the first time in her life, Evelyn was beginning to believe that the answer was hidden somewhere inside the palace itself. Evelyn spent the rest of the day trying to convince herself that she had misunderstood what she overheard. Yet every time she replayed the conversation in her mind, the same conclusion returned. Someone had hidden the truth about her past. Someone powerful. By evening, dark clouds had gathered above Blackwood Palace. Rain tapped softly against the tall windows as servants prepared guest rooms and extinguished unnecessary candles. The celebration was over, but a strange tension lingered throughout the palace. Whispers followed Evelyn wherever she went. Conversations stopped when she entered a room. Eyes lingered on her a little too long. The feeling of being watched had become impossible to ignore. As night settled over the kingdom, Mrs. Whitmore summoned Evelyn to a small storage room near the western wing. The elderly housekeeper rarely looked frightened, but tonight her hands trembled slightly as she closed the door behind them. "You must listen carefully," she said. Evelyn immediately felt her stomach tighten. "What is happening?" Mrs. Whitmore looked toward the door as though afraid someone might be listening. "There are people asking questions about you." Questions. Questions that should have remained buried years ago. Evelyn's heartbeat quickened. "You know something?" The older woman closed her eyes briefly. "More than I ever wanted to." Silence filled the small room. Rain pattered softly against the distant windows. Finally, Mrs. Whitmore reached beneath her apron and removed a small cloth bundle. The fabric appeared old. Very old. Yellowed by time. "I have kept this hidden for 22 years, she whispered. Evelyn stared at it. "What is it?" Mrs. Whitmore carefully unfolded the cloth. Inside rested a silver pendant shaped like a crescent moon. The moment Evelyn saw it, a strange feeling swept through her chest. She could not explain it. The pendant looked familiar even though she had never seen it before. Her fingers trembled as she reached toward it. "This was found with you," Mrs. Whitmore said softly, "the night you arrived at the palace." Evelyn lifted the pendant into her palm. The metal felt warm despite its age. Along the back, tiny symbols had been engraved into the silver surface. Symbols that matched the mark beneath her sleeve. Her breath caught. "Why did you never tell me?" Mrs. Whitmore looked away. "Because I was told not to." "By who?" Before the older woman could answer, a loud knock echoed through the door. Both women froze. Another knock followed. Sharper this time. Mrs. Whitmore quickly wrapped the pendant and pushed it into Evelyn's hands. "Hide it." "What?" "Now." Evelyn slipped the bundle into her pocket just as the door opened. Lady Victoria Ashcroft entered without waiting for permission. Her elegant appearance remained flawless as always, but her smile felt colder than usual. Her gaze moved between them. "There you are," she said. "The palace has been searching for you." Evelyn forced herself to remain calm. "For me?" "Yes." Victoria stepped closer. "An item has gone missing from the royal archives." The room seemed to grow colder. "Missing? A very important item." Victoria folded her arms. "And several witnesses claim they saw you near the records chamber." Evelyn felt the blood drain from her face. She had never entered the archives. She had never touched anything there. Yet something in Victoria's expression told her the accusation was already prepared, as though the decision had been made long before this moment. Mrs. Whitmore stepped forward. "There must be some mistake." Victoria's smile never reached her eyes. "The Palace Council will decide that tomorrow." Then she looked directly at Evelyn. "I hope you can explain yourself." As Victoria walked away, the silence she left behind felt heavier than thunder. Evelyn stood motionless, her hand pressed against the hidden pendant in her pocket. Deep down, she suddenly understood something terrifying. Whoever had hidden her past had realized the truth was beginning to surface, and now they were moving against her. The next morning dawned gray and cold. Heavy clouds covered the sky above Blackwood Palace, casting long shadows across the stone courtyards. Evelyn barely slept. The silver pendant remained hidden beneath her uniform, resting close to her heart. Every time she touched it, she felt the same strange warmth. It was as if the small piece of silver carried memories she could not quite reach. By mid-morning, palace bells echoed through the halls. The council hearing was about to begin. Servants whispered nervously as nobles gathered inside the great chamber. Evelyn followed a palace guard through towering doors and into the largest room she had ever entered as anything other than a servant. Hundreds of eyes immediately turned toward her. The attention made her stomach twist. She kept her head lowered and focused on breathing. One breath in, one breath out. At the far end of the chamber sat members of the royal council. Lady Victoria Ashcroft occupied a place near the front. Her expression remained calm, but satisfaction gleamed behind her eyes. Professor Hawthorne stood nearby holding several old documents, and above them all sat Alpha King Damon Blackwood. His face revealed nothing. The hearing began. A council member rose from his seat. Evelyn Hart, you stand accused of removing a protected artifact from the royal archives. Murmurs spread throughout the chamber. Evelyn's pulse quickened. I did not take anything, she said quietly. Several witnesses place you near the archive wing. Another council member replied. I was assigned duties there. Convenient. More whispers followed. Evelyn could feel judgment filling the room. Years of serving these people had taught her how quickly powerful voices could shape a story. Lady Victoria finally stood. The missing artifact is not ordinary. She paused dramatically. It is connected to the oldest royal records in the kingdom. The chamber grew silent. Without it, important evidence regarding the royal bloodline may be lost forever. Evelyn felt her chest tighten. Something about the accusation felt carefully designed. Not random, not accidental. As though someone wanted the discussion centered on royal history. Professor Hawthorne suddenly stepped forward. There is another option. Every eye turned toward him. The elderly scholar looked toward the king. Your Majesty, perhaps the matter can be settled through verification. Damon nodded once. Proceed. Hawthorne carefully opened one of the ancient books. Certain bloodlines carry unique identifying marks. Rare marks that cannot be forged. Evelyn's heartbeat stumbled. Instinctively, she pulled her sleeve lower. If questions regarding heritage now affect this investigation, Hawthorne continued, we should establish the truth. The room became perfectly still. Lady Victoria's confidence seemed to falter for the first time. Damon rose slowly from his seat. The movement alone commanded complete silence. His silver eyes settled on Evelyn. Show them your arm. The request sounded gentle, yet it carried the weight of a royal command. Evelyn swallowed hard. Her hands trembled slightly. Every instinct urged her to hide, to run, to remain the invisible servant she had always been. But something deeper pushed back, a quiet strength she had never felt before. Slowly, she rolled back her sleeve. Gasps rippled through the chamber. The silver mark beneath her skin seemed brighter than before. Not glowing, simply unmistakable. Ancient, beautiful, familiar. Professor Hawthorne closed his eyes briefly as though confirming a truth he had feared for years. Lady Victoria stared in shock. Several nobles exchanged alarmed glances. And for the first time since entering the chamber, Damon Blackwood allowed emotion to appear in his expression. Recognition, not suspicion, not curiosity. Recognition. Then Professor Hawthorne spoke the words that changed everything. That crest belonged only to one family. Silence swallowed the room. The lost Omega royal line. The words hung in the air like a bell that refused to stop ringing. No one spoke. No one moved. Evelyn stood at the center of the great chamber with her sleeve rolled back, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. The lost Omega royal line. She had heard stories about them as a child. Every servant in the palace had. They were spoken about the way people spoke about legends. A noble family blessed by the moon goddess. A royal house that vanished more than 2 decades ago after a mysterious tragedy. She had never imagined those stories could have anything to do with her. Across the chamber, faces that once looked through her now stared at her in disbelief. Nobles whispered behind trembling hands. Council members exchanged uneasy glances. Even the guards appeared uncertain. Professor Hawthorne carefully opened another ancient book. His weathered fingers moved across faded pages before stopping on a painted illustration. There were only 3 surviving records of the royal crest, he said quietly. One in the royal archives, one in the northern sanctuary, and one recorded in the birth registry of Princess Elena Ashbourne's child. Evelyn barely heard the gasps that followed. Her mind had fixed on a single word. Child. Hawthorne lifted the book so the council could see. The illustration revealed the same crescent symbol resting beneath her skin. The same delicate silver lines. The same unmistakable mark. The records state that the infant princess disappeared during her first year. Hawthorne continued. No remains were ever found. No evidence was ever recovered. Silence returned. Heavy and absolute. Evelyn felt as though the ground beneath her feet had shifted. Her entire life had been built upon a simple truth. She was a servant, a forgotten girl, a nobody. Now that foundation was crumbling before her eyes. "This is impossible," Lady Victoria suddenly said. Her voice cut through the room. "A mark proves nothing." Several nobles immediately nodded in agreement. Victoria stepped forward, confidence returning to her expression. Anyone could fabricate a story after 22 years. But before anyone could respond, Mrs. Whitmore entered the chamber. The elderly housekeeper moved slowly, carrying something wrapped in faded white cloth. Every eye turned toward her. Evelyn's breath caught. She recognized the bundle instantly. Mrs. Whitmore approached the council table and carefully unfolded the fabric. Inside rested the silver pendant. A collective murmur swept through the room. Hawthorne stared at it in astonishment. "The royal moon pendant," he whispered. "I thought it was lost." Mrs. Whitmore looked toward Evelyn. Tears glistened in her eyes. "She arrived carrying this." The old woman's voice trembled. "I kept it hidden because I was told it would protect her." Victoria's expression faltered. For the first time, genuine concern appeared on her face. Hawthorne examined the pendant closely. Then he turned it over. The back contained a tiny inscription worn by time. He read the words aloud. "For Princess Evelyn Ashbourne, beloved daughter of the moon." The chamber erupted into shocked whispers. Evelyn's knees nearly gave way beneath her. Princess Evelyn Ashbourne. The name echoed through her mind. It felt unfamiliar, yet somehow it also felt like coming home. Slowly, she lifted her gaze. Across the chamber, Alpha King Damon Blackwood was already looking at her. Not as a servant, not as an accused girl standing before a council, but as someone he had finally found after searching for far longer than she realized. For several long seconds, no one spoke. The revelation settled over the great chamber like a wave rolling across still water. Evelyn stood frozen at the center of it all, the silver pendant resting in her trembling hands. Princess Evelyn Ashbourne. The name still felt unreal. Around her, nobles who had barely acknowledged her existence now stared as though they were looking at an entirely different person. Some appeared shocked. Others looked uneasy. A few seemed afraid. Lady Victoria remained perfectly still, but the confidence that had carried her through the hearing was gone. Her eyes darted towards several council members as though searching for support that no longer existed. Professor Hawthorne carefully closed the ancient book and drew a slow breath. "The evidence is overwhelming," he said. "The crest, the pendant, the missing records, and the timeline all align." Murmurs swept through the chamber again. Evelyn barely heard them. Her mind was racing through memories. Scrubbing palace floors before sunrise. Carrying trays through crowded halls. Standing silently while others mocked her. All those years she had believed she was invisible. All those years she had accepted a place that was never truly hers. A movement at the front of the chamber pulled her attention away from her thoughts. Alpha King Damon Blackwood stepped down from the raised platform. The sound of his footsteps echoed across the marble floor. Every conversation immediately died. Every eye followed him. Evelyn's pulse quickened. She watched as he crossed the chamber toward her. No guards followed. No council members spoke. It felt as though the entire kingdom had suddenly narrowed to the distance between them. Damon stopped several feet away. His silver eyes held hers steadily. There was no judgment in them. No pity. Only certainty. 22 years, he said quietly. The chamber remained silent enough for everyone to hear. 22 years ago, the kingdom lost more than a royal child. His gaze never left Evelyn. It lost hope. The words struck something deep inside her. Her throat tightened. Damon slowly turned toward the gathered nobles. Many believed the Omega royal line had ended forever. His voice carried easily throughout the hall. Today we know that was never true. Several council members immediately lowered their heads. Others shifted uncomfortably. Then something happened that no one expected. Damon placed one hand over his heart and bowed his head respectfully toward Evelyn. Gasps spread through the room. The Alpha King was showing public honor to a former servant. The meaning was impossible to ignore. One by one, council members followed his example. Then the nobles. Then the guards. Within moments, The entire chamber stood in respectful silence. Evelyn's eyes widened. Her breath caught. She had spent her entire life looking up at others. Now the room before her had transformed completely. Tears threatened to form, but she blinked them away. Across the hall, Mrs. Whitmore pressed a hand to her mouth. Professor Hawthorne smiled for the first time that day. Even Lady Victoria lowered her gaze. Damon looked back at Evelyn. "No matter what title you choose to carry," he said softly, "your worth was never determined by how others treated you." The words settled into her heart with unexpected warmth. For the first time since this impossible journey began, fear loosened its grip. She did not know what tomorrow would bring. She did not know who had hidden her identity or why. But standing beneath the light pouring through the chamber windows, Evelyn finally understood one thing. The story of her life had never been about a servant trying to find her place. It had always been about a lost princess finding her way home. The days that followed transformed Blackwood Palace in ways Evelyn could scarcely comprehend. Servants who once hurried past without noticing her now greeted her respectfully. Council members requested audiences. Nobles who had never spoken her name suddenly remembered it with remarkable clarity. Yet the change that mattered most had nothing to do with titles or ceremonies. It was the quiet feeling growing inside her each morning when she woke. For the first time in her life, she no longer felt lost. A week after the hearing, the palace gardens bloomed beneath a sky washed clean by spring rain. White roses lined the stone pathways. Fountains sparkled beneath the afternoon sun. Evelyn stood beside one of the reflecting pools, turning the silver pendant slowly between her fingers. The metal caught the light just as it had 22 years ago. Behind her, familiar footsteps approached. She smiled before turning around. Alpha King Damon Blackwood stopped beside her. Neither spoke immediately. The gardens were peaceful. Birds sang from nearby trees. The kingdom seemed calmer than it had in years. Damon looked toward the pendant. Professor Hawthorne finally finished restoring the missing records. Evelyn's heart quickened. Did he find anything else? Damon nodded. Enough to understand what happened. His voice remained gentle. The people who hid your identity feared what your family represented. They believed erasing your name would erase your legacy. Evelyn looked down at the pendant resting in her palm. And they were wrong. Completely wrong. A soft laugh escaped her. It felt strange how much had changed in such a short time. Yet some things remained exactly the same. She still remembered every servant who had shown her kindness. Every long day. Every difficult moment. Those memories no longer felt painful. They felt valuable. They had shaped the person she became. Damon studied her expression. "Do you regret knowing the truth?" The question surprised her. She thought about it carefully. She thought about the confusion, the fear, the uncertainty. Then she shook her head. No, her answer came easily. Because the truth did not change who I am. Warm sunlight danced across the water beside them. Damon smiled slightly. Exactly. Several days later, a ceremony was held in the palace courtyard. People traveled from every corner of the kingdom. Families filled the terraces. Banners fluttered above ancient stone walls. When Evelyn stepped onto the platform, a hush settled across the crowd. She wore a simple white gown trimmed with silver embroidery, not because she wanted to appear royal, because it reminded her of the blanket that had arrived with her all those years ago. Professor Hawthorne formally restored her family name. The council recognized her heritage. The kingdom welcomed her home. Yet the moment that remained in people's hearts happened afterward. When asked what title she wished to claim, Evelyn looked across the crowd and smiled. "The same one I have always carried," she said. "A servant of this kingdom." Silence lasted only a second before applause echoed through the courtyard. Some people laughed. Others wiped away tears. Damon stood nearby watching her with unmistakable pride. As evening settled over Blackwood Palace, the first stars appeared above the towers. Music drifted through the warm air. Lanterns glowed softly along the garden paths. Standing beneath the moonlight, Evelyn finally understood something her younger self could never have imagined. True worth had never come from a crown, a title, or a forgotten bloodline. It came from kindness given when no one was watching, from courage shown when no one believed in you. And sometimes, the girl everyone overlooked turned out to be exactly the person a kingdom had been waiting for all along.